onto kind of an art form, a science and an art form. Now I go to my profile, and then I scroll down and I look. I still don't see it here. So I know I clicked the button and I don't see anything happening yet. So I'm going to go back here. It looks like we just went live, but I'm not sure. See, I don't trust any of this type of stuff. But I'm going to assume as soon as okay, Tim says, welcome, Leland. Okay, now I'm beginning to see people. Even though I haven't seen myself yet on Twitter, I see people saying, so I kind of believe them.
We're live. Good.
We are, and I still don't see it on mine, but you know what? I believe it. I do. Okay. This time I trust technology. So thank you everybody for joining us. And I see Luke here, and thank you, Luke. Luke will be joining us in the future, and I'm very excited about that, to discuss gold. So we're going to do a kind of a recurring thing that I'm very excited about, where we're just going to devote a couple of minutes to kind of a question and answer about gold. And with all of that said, and hello to everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. And hello to you, Leland. And I have the pleasure of looking at you. And I see everybody else's name, but I have the pleasure of looking at you. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Would you be kind enough to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. My name is Leland Miller. I'm CEO of China Beige Book, co-founder originally of China Beige Book. And we are the largest private data collection operation in the world, working inside the Chinese economy. We collect data from thousands and thousands and thousands of firms. We track growth and the labor market and inflation, and particularly the credit markets, including shadow finance, to try to not just get a number on China, but try to figure out all the different little Chinas and figure out what's going on across the country, across growth, and through a whole bunch of different metrics. Credit, of course, being extremely important, one of them. And then we relay that. And usually we have a very, very different message than what Beijing is saying, because they have reasons to tell a different story.
Yeah, and when I think of your shop, I think of it as an intel shop, because you have so much intel that are kind of feet on the street, which is something that most banks and most firms that are specialists in China don't really have a lot of feet on the street. And what they're getting a lot of anecdotal information from here and from there. So, and that's very imperfect and always very incomplete information, because in itself, it's very difficult to find truth in China. Even amongst the banking, they're just so reluctant for anybody to speak about anything and to openly share. So there's always a bit of a fudge factor. So when I think of you guys, I think of it as an intel shop that actually has like little James Bonds. That's how I think of it, kind of situated throughout.
I like that. We got to figure out a way to incorporate that in the logo. But you can't do China with anecdotes. You can't do it. You shouldn't be doing anything these days without big data, without thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of inputs. So you need data to be able to do anything competently these days, particularly China. But your other point is a great one. I mean, look, if you're looking on the street right now, you're seeing 10,000 little booklets published by this bank or this institution. Here's what's happening in China. What are these things? They're not research. They're not people going in and getting the real story. They're people taking Chinese official data or derivatives of that official data, putting it into some pretty PowerPoints and telling a story. Now, what story are they telling? They're clearly telling a story where they can talk their book. So if you're a big institution and you need the Chinese government to let you in order to be able to do more asset management business, to be able to do more private wealth, to get more underwriting deals, are you going to say a big scary story about how much debt China has or all the problems with the Chinese economy? No, you're going to say Beijing data look good, recovery always excellent, party always engineering the right type of rally, and you're never going to get the real story. So one of the things that we're very proud of is we don't have a book to talk. We have only one mission, and that is to get the story right 100% of the time.
Yeah, and so let's go backwards a little bit. And I was doing something else, and now I'm going to go back to where I can see you. So let's go backwards a little bit, because we had met last in November, right? Wasn't that about right? You were about to go to Silicon Valley, and so at that time we were hoping to see no one was really sure if there was going to be a first trade deal, right? There was a lot of uncertainty in the market. Again, a lot of imperfect information. There was a lot of anxiety on the U.S. side because, they wanted good headlines and they want to show forward progress, and it is what it is. And there was a lot of anxiety probably on their side also. And I think we were discussing a lot of that because, they've got to suffer through a lot of their own instability as well. And the first trade deal we saw was imperfect, right? It was there was a lot of unknowns about it, and then when those things became known, it was kind of an unsatisfactory deal for a lot of people. My feeling at the time was that we needed to get the deal done in any way, shape, or form because China was going through a real debt-denominated, dollar-denominated crunch. So could you give could we start back, I guess, to around November when we first started seeing the first trade deal occur?
Yeah. So on the economy or on the trade dynamics?
Let's first go on the trade dynamics because then we can tie it back into the economy.
Right. Well, one of the hardest things to figure out about this administration is what's the China strategy, because you had President Trump very focused on trade imbalances and tariffs and buying more agricultural goods, and that was his focus. And then along the sides, when you were talking about trade, he was less interested. So you had hawks fighting over certain things, doves battling doves. But what you had throughout the administration was trying to push a big trade deal where President Trump could redefine the narrative, say, look, China's been beating us. They're exporting too much. They're importing too little. We need something to restart the playing field, to completely change the playing field. And phase one became his message on that. They originally envisaged a much bigger deal, something that there was a, enormous amount of tariffs. They were going to pull back 60, 70% of those tariffs, and there was going to be a much bigger deal. And that just became very, very difficult to manage. So at the end of the year, phase one started coming together as a baby deal. And it was being sold as the first step, the phase one of many. But I think most people who were involved in this, including us, were saying at the time, look, this is all you have unless there's a second term. Because, the Chinese government is willing to say they'll buy things, but they're not willing to do structural adjustments to their economy unless there's enormous pressure, which would be very politically difficult for any U.S. president to push. So you saw phase one. It was in some ways the low-hanging fruit. But then here we are, and that's all we have. And now, so we have to judge the trade first 4 years off of phase one, not what it may be over the next 8 years, 4 years to 8 years.
Yeah. So now going back, because I want to go backwards so that we can really move forwards with this thing, because China does owe the United States a lot of money. So in dollars. So that's always going to be a part of a trade consideration. They can hold their loans kind of hostage, right? They might say, we're not going to satisfy them or not satisfy them on schedule. And they also have the ability on their side to kind of close up those shops and put them into.
I don't think it's a real risk. On paper, they can say that we hold, $1 trillion of liabilities. We will do something injurious to the U.S. economy, and so don't punish us because we have this leverage over you. In reality, what China has are foreign exchange reserves, which are assets marked against other liabilities. If they were to get out of the U.S. dollar, like they threatened to do, and all their state tabloids to always threaten to do, hey, be nice to us or we're going to dump the dollar. They have to put that capital into something else. What are you going to do? You buy a bunch of euro, a bunch of yen? Where is there a deep enough, liquid enough market to do this? And if you did, right now, I think that people would gobble up those U.S. dollars, and I think it hurt China more than Beige. It hurt Beijing more than it would DC. So you hear a lot about all this debt between the two and how China has these leverage points. I don't see it as a fundamental problem for the United States, because I think that if they ever did something like that, which is extraordinarily unlikely, it's going to hurt China way, way, way more than the United States.
Yeah, that's always what I've thought. So the first part of this series, I call this the investor series, was with Valina. And what we were discussing at that time was the bifurcation of the world. We are definitely seeing the world probably for the first time and I can't say with the historical record, but certainly since World War II, we're seeing countries having to really align with one way or the other. While it's before they could have this kind of ad hoc, picking and kind of choosing very opportunistically. Now they really have to have some kind of a firm, concrete ally, and they can't really waver from it. So we're seeing what I think of as a bifurcation of the world. And with that being said, China is gobbling up a lot of share. So I think we're seeing Europe decline, and at the same time, we're not as much seeing the skyrocketing of China as sometimes I hear that argument, but we're seeing China gobble up a lot of the weakness that's occurring out of Europe and out of other countries. So I also don't see vulnerability to the dollar. So I agree with you completely. I don't see any opportunity for there to be vulnerability to the dollar. And I'm not even sure if China, despite all their rhetoric, really wants to be the dominant currency, because then they've got to play by the rules and they've got to put money in foreign.
Bingo. Yeah. They don't want it. What they want, they piggyback off the dollar. So we wrote a big report a couple of years ago called the yuan is the dollar painted red. And what we meant by that is China can talk all it wants about wanting to be a global reserve currency or internationalization of the yuan. Little bits of that are happening on the latter. They don't want to be a global reserve currency. What they want to do is they want to control their economy. They want to keep the capital outflows to a minimum. And what they'd like to do right now is piggyback on the stability of the dollar going forward. So if China had the ability, which they don't, but if they did have the ability to sort of turn off that global reserve currency switch for the dollar, they'll talk the talk on that, but that would be a disaster for them. There is nobody in serious economic circles in Beijing who actually wants that to happen.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it makes for good rhetoric. It really does. It
Great
makes
rhetoric.
Something that people who are kind of anti-stasis, right, want to see things topple. And I can appreciate that. And it does make for some compelling kind of investment theses. It's just not the one that I've become enamored of. I just don't see it happening. And I do want to say hello, because there's a lot of people here and you're going to have a lot of questions, Leland. So in advance of them, I know that Luke has some questions. And I also want to make sure that you have a chance to say hello to Jen. And so I'm going to put him up here in just a moment. Oh, here he says you're definitely live. And I'm going to make the introduction to you guys offline also, because Jan is with Epic Times, and he has really a remarkable video series that he does himself that really goes into depth there. So I would definitely agree that that China has no desire to do that. The American dollar is one of the good things about our trade deficit, is that our American dollars are in every single bank in the world, and they're in every single trade bank. But now we are definitely seeing a very aggressive Belt and Road strategy, where they are pushing out the yuan. They are using that as kind of their monopoly money. And we're also seeing it, they're very predatory against countries with very weak GDPs that right now are suffering, particularly because of their own economic volatility that's occurring.
Yeah. So Belt and Road is interesting for me, because I get more tomatoes thrown at me for the following comment than just about anything. And it's that I think we overhype the hell out of the Belt and Road. That does not mean there are not issues there. There are not soft power issues. There's not issues of debt diplomacy, where China's cracking down and taking ports and taking infrastructure from countries. There's corruption. There's all kinds of issues to worry about. And if you're a company involved in it, there's a way to make plenty of money. So none of that is untrue. But I think the people have worried about Belt and Road based on what it was conceived to be rather than what it is. So if you look at what Belt and Road is origins years ago, what was it, 2014, 2013, somewhere in there when it started gaining all steam. And shortly thereafter, Xi Jinping bought into it, and it became this very prominent issue because it had Xi's fingerprints on it. What essentially was you had Chinese forex reserves that were at the 4 trillion level. They look like they could go up forever. And the Chinese had a very big political problem. They can't just keep collecting forex reserves to the world. They had to recycle them. So one of the features of Belt and Road was they were going to take these reserves, and they were going to recycle them abroad. They were going to take all this overcapacity in commodities that China oversupply in everything. They were going to recycle these abroad so that their neighbors and Africa and Central Asia and South Asia and anybody who needed it had all the commodities they needed in order to build. And they would use this sort of hand in hand with Chinese foreign policy in order to use the strength of the Chinese system, which was this enormous wall of capital and all this oversupply, and use this in order to push China's presence formally, informally throughout the world. Now, it was a good idea, but the problem is that just a couple of years later, the problem wasn't too many reserves. It was whether they were having enough reserves. So in 2016, you had an outflow crisis, and $3 trillion is plenty. We said at the time, we still say now, $3 trillion is not something that puts the Chinese economy in any particular trouble. There's plenty of reserves. But the problem was that they no longer had this issue where they're trying to pump all their money abroad. They actually have to keep it home. And the big problem going forward with the Chinese economy right now is that they need to suck in capital in order for their model to work. So the entire reason for Belt and Road sort of fell through over the past 5 years. They were stuck with this thing. One, because they wanted to recycle these commodities, and two, because Xi Jinping had already put his fingerprints on it. So you had this very mixed program, which is doing things they like, which is doing things they don't like. But whenever I'm talking to policymakers, and I used to do this in the Obama administration, and I did it in the Trump administration, and there's all this angst over Belt and Road, I would say, what are the Chinese, particularly Chinese government officials, what is Beijing particularly bad at doing? Investing efficiently. Do we think these loans are going out around the world and they're getting a great return on investment? It's being done clean and we're going to see this. We're going to see. No, they're going to lose a bunch of money in places like Venezuela and Central Asia and everything else.
In Bolivia. I was just in Bolivia and I saw it there as well.
Yeah, it's all around the world. So, are there risks here? Of course. They need to be monitored. They need to be closely watched. But a lot of what the Chinese are doing is going to be injurious to their own system because they don't know how to do this type of investing abroad. So Belt and Road needs to be seen for what it is, not for what it was thought it would once be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, and we get to go back to the conversation we were having in November, because at that time I was already seeing kind of a collapse within the Belt and Road, where there was just a lot of overcapacity in what's called the Rust Belt, which is in the mainland, which is where they do all the manufacture and assembly and parts for a lot of high-end electronics, but also a lot of mattresses and AC adapters and a whole bunch of stuff there. And it's where they were also building the back ends for all the nuclear power plants and the coal plants, and then shipping them overseas. And they were already losing a lot of orders. And I saw them losing orders. And part of that was because there was so much corruption. They were just doing such a bad job in the manufacture of some of these things. We saw Ecuador, where they just had what was it, a dam? It was a dam, right? That literally stopped damming. The whole thing just fell apart. It essentially almost bankrupted Ecuador. They required a $4 billion bailout. And people were seeing this all over the world, what China was doing. And now we're seeing them trying to revive, trying to reimagine their PR. And they are doing a pretty good job of imagining their PR. So do you see the Belt and Road now? Is that something that we're going to be hearing less of? Or does this now give them an opportunity, because of the current kind of Western weaknesses? Does this now give them an opportunity to take something that really wasn't that vibrant and make it so?
I don't think so, because I don't think the investment opportunities out there are getting better after coronavirus, after a global trading recession. So will the Chinese be out there trying to find partners to invest in that helps their soft power? Sure. But I think the other mistake here is that everything that happens abroad that has at least two Chinese people in it is now mistakenly called Belt and Road. So if you have a mom and pop shop open in Ghana, someone calls it part of Belt and Road. No, that's just investments. So there's this gray area that sort of merged what formal Belt and Road is with just activities by Chinese people or the Chinese government. So there's a very hazy definition of what Belt and Road actually is. Now, I do think that there will be opportunities out there to strategically invest in countries, but I think right now, look, again, it gets back to the fact: when has China ever showed itself able to efficiently invest in anything, domestically or or externally, when they're going into countries, one of the reasons they have this debt diplomacy is sometimes it's layered with corruption, sometimes it isn't. But you go in, there's not markets that are operating to get the best people. They're bringing in their own people, they're bringing their own workforce, they're buying whatever they have. Half of it's being paid off for certain things in order to get it done. It's not an efficient instrument for Chinese financial statecraft. It may be an instrument of soft power that they appreciate, but it's not a great instrument of Chinese financial statecraft.
But does this now allow them to repair some of their own, what they call SOEs, right? Which are their state-owned enterprises? Does that now give them an opportunity to kind of rein in all those things? And one of the weaknesses that we always saw with it is that there was really no quality control. They were always using kind of counterfeit tools, counterfeit instruments, counterfeit cements, counterfeit metals. And even though there's less of an appetite because the world's a little bit weaker now than it was a few years ago, does this now, the world is still being bifurcated. Their countries are still having to choose sides along military borders and everything else that they weren't having to do before. So does this now give China an opportunity, though, to kind of recapture more of what's been lost by Europe and by other countries' weaknesses?
If they were out there fighting for market share, or if they were intent on actually reforming their SOEs, there's opportunities. But I mean, is that what they're doing right now? I don't see SOE reform. I see the opposite. For all the talk about building up private enterprises, what they're doing is centralizing everything. So there are opportunities out there, but if they're not in accord with what she wants the party to do politically, it doesn't matter what opportunities there are. So I don't want to play down Belt and Road altogether. I think that you could take anecdotal examples or a series of examples in which Belt and Road becomes a very powerful tool for the Chinese. I think that overall, though, that Belt and Road is going to become probably less prominent over time. Certain areas it may become more prominent. I think Belt and Road as this tool of Chinese foreign policy is going to become less prominent over time. Wow,
that's interesting. So is that to say that a lot of it is, and I hate to use the word propaganda because that can sound negative or positive. It just is such a peculiar term to use that it's lost. It's kind of an ambiguous thing. But how much of that then is just their propaganda that they're pumping overseas? Are they using this as a way to kind of cloak their own internal weaknesses and their own internal kind of disruption that's occurred within their own economy?
Yeah, that's the name of the game. I mean, look, the important thing here is that Xi Jinping is associated with Belt and Road. So you cannot have a failed Belt and Road program. That's just guaranteed. So anything that comes out about Belt and Road going forward will be a success story. It'll be a small success story or a medium success story or a gigantic success story. But there's the Chinese state-owned media all of a sudden going to come and say, Xi Jinping really erred on this. His judgment is questionable. Belt and Road is really flailing. Wish he wouldn't have done that one. That's not how China works. So this is going to be propaganda. It doesn't mean there's not victories along the way. It just means that you can't take this stuff seriously. It's the narrative. It's a political narrative being spun as an economic narrative, which is exactly what the data are. That's what official data are.
Yeah, the official data is definitely not too helpful in doing forensics on Chinese economy. And I know we're going to talk about shadow banking in just a moment, but it brings up an interesting point, and one I've really thought about a lot. Is I don't expect Xi to remain in office. I think it's going to be very difficult for him because Belt and Road has really suffered in Pakistan. China, the China elites never really wanted to go into Pakistan because they saw the violent volatility that's over there and the separatist movements and everything else. They were always against the push into what's called the special economic zones, and they were also very against. From what I hear with my little James Bonds over there, they were always very against as much expeditions as China did, where they went into Sri Lanka and they went into all these countries. And that's also in a way that elites get their own money out of the country. So they use this in some ways the same way the KGB was using the USSR the expansion to get their money out, put it into safe havens. And do you think that Xi will survive all of what's happening right now, where we're seeing a failure on the on the Belt and Road? We're also seing that Exim Bank, which is kind of the mechanism that they've used for all of this, has was never properly funded to begin with, and now it was so predatory that the countries that are the Belt and Road clients are not going to be able to service their debt, and that becomes a real problem when we're talking about Djibouti, talking about Tajikistan, up and down, throughout the world, pretty much Montenegro.
Yeah.
So do you think that that Xi can remain with all the disruption that's occurring and all the weakness that is happening internally that Americans don't really see? You see it, I see it, but there's no cameras on mainland, and there's no cameras in their banking headquarters like there are in ours.
So I agree with all your points, but I do think she will survive. But what's happened over the last couple of years has been Xi Jinping not just taking control and not just being structurally allowed to stay in as what's going to be chairman for life, but also the party constitution's been changed, and there's been some formality so that he could be around for a long time. Now, here, on the one hand, this allows him a long runway. This has been formalized. On the other hand, because he's been so tied in, he has now become one with China and with China's economy. So if you talk about the failings of China's economy, Xi's leadership is now so interwoven into that concept that you can't say you have a failing or slowing Chinese economy and not give Xi some of the blame for that. If you have problems in Taiwan or Hong Kong because Xi is the party, is the state, Xi will get some of the blame for that. So on the one hand, I think this may help his longevity, but I think it dulls his power over time, because I think as this goes along, and as China's, no matter how good their policies are, economic, military, financial, political, threading the needle for the next 5, 10, 20 years is going to be an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and probably an impossible thing with a one-party system, which means a lot of this angst, a lot of this blame is going to be heaped on Xi, who represents the leadership of the Chinese economy, the leadership of the Chinese military. So I think his power as China's paramount leader will actually dull over time, that he'll be prima inter pares with a bunch of other standing committee members, 5, 10 years from now, similar to, say, like Hu Jintao. But I don't see getting rid of him unless something much more dramatic happened inside the Chinese political system. I don't see elements of that happening right now. It's certainly possible. Anything can happen. But the future that I see for Xi Jinping is him being around for a while, just losing elements of his power over time, as China's future is not quite as beautiful and golden as originally promised.
Yeah, interesting. And there's so much to talk about, and there's so many questions, and I want to make sure I'm responsive to everybody's questions. So I'm just going to interrogate him a little bit further, and then I'm going to open it up, because there's some really good questions here about TikTok. And I saw Luke has some questions as well. So I really want to make sure I get into everything. I'll tell you my own expectation a little bit is that with the change in the constitution over there, where the Chinese Communist Party constitution is now just this real superseding document over the Chinese, over the PRC, the People's Republic of China constitution, because they're two different pieces of paper, that it really foreclosed on any of the provincial CCP members or any of the lower Communist Party members from being able to move up. So I think that, they changed everything, the political apparatus, and now it's a very small group. While as it used to be, the powerful elite used to have a group of about 20 people, I guess, 25 people, and it was called a small group. And now the entire Congress is not even an emissarial role anymore. It's just a meaningless type of thing. So I think that people, the Chinese Communist Party members that want to increase their career opportunities are going to be eager to see Xi taken out of office, because with him they've got no room to move up. If there were a displacement of him, I think it would give them a little bit more lateral movement. So hopefully we'll see him gone a little bit soon. So I guess at some point we should have like a betting pool on it. That'd be awesome. I'd be on the under, I think. And I want to get to some questions here because they're so interesting. And Manny, and thank you so much for being here, Manny, says, would you please speak to TikTok?
Sure. So what TikTok started as is a very disorganized process by the government to punish a Chinese company. And I think that people in the White House who were spearheading this were a little bit more optimistic than they should have been, that there was going to be an easy solution. Now, the solution that came out, what was it, a week or two ago, was horrible. It was a horrible solution because, look, if you're talking about the problems with TikTok, like what do we actually care about that TikTok does? Or at least what are we evaluating them for? The first is, what data do they hold in their system? So in the front door, what data do they control? The second is, does TikTok provide, or could they provide, backdoors for the Beijing leadership to get that data? So the first is, with their data, are they doing nefarious things, or do they have the possibility to do nefarious things? Are they taking too much privacy, not paying attention to as much privacy issues as they should have? Backdoor, are they letting the Chinese government in? And then, of course, what are they doing with this algorithm? So the algorithm is this very sophisticated machine learning technology that is allowing them to target different segments of the population. If they wanted to affect the U.S. political discourse, and they're targeting certain young people with certain messages and older people to the extent they're on there with other messages, they have the ability to do that. Now, are they doing that? I don't know. But there was really three different buckets in order to evaluate them from. What does the current solution with Oracle solve? I think it solves few, if any, of them. And the problem here is even bigger than just the fact that there's a solution that looks scummy. Forget whether there's actual corruption. When the president handed this deal to one of his campaign fundraisers, it looks bad. It's not a good thing to do from an optic standpoint. But even besides the fact, what are Oracle their motives? Oracle is being given an equity stake in TikTok. And then the same Oracle is being expected to regulate TikTok's behavior going forward. They have a financial incentive to not crack down on TikTok or TikTok Global, the successor entity, through everything they're doing. Do they have malintent? Do they not intend to go? It doesn't matter. As we know, anyone in finance should understand this is all about incentives. Everything is all about incentives. And what you're doing is you're giving a U.S. company a financial incentive for TikTok to do better, and then giving them a regulatory role, saying if TikTok's not doing what we want to, crack down and potentially destroy the company. So from every single angle, this is a terrible deal. And I think that when it's kind of getting into the national security questions, that a lot of the hawks said, look, this isn't about the White House or politics or anything else. This is a terrible precedent to set here, because if we're saying that we're just going to hand this off and not deal with the actual problem, then that's going to be the precedent for the next company and for the next company. So there is an enormous danger here, not just in getting the problem wrong, but setting a precedent that screws the U.S. ability to regulate these apps in legitimate ways going forward. So I see this has been a disaster for the last month, and they're just starting to recognize some of the problems.
That was really helpful for me. I didn't understand. That's really interesting. I never considered a lot of that. I saw the problem from a different perspective, and one that's not as really robust as the one that you articulated, which is I know the little bit of the history of TikTok and ByteDance, and then the founder of it, Yiming, and his very public allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. So in China, as you observed, there has to be an adherence to Xi, to the Chinese Communist Party. And so what he implemented, I guess about 5 years ago now, was called the Four Consciousnesses of Yi. So it's these things that cascade down that says that every business and every person has to, essentially, it's broken into 4 different buckets, but all those buckets land into the same river, which is they all have to put the Chinese Communist Party first and foremost in every single thing that they do. And so that was with Cao, was that the name of it? Toshi. It was with Toshi. And he left Toshi, then he founded ByteDance, and then now we have TikTok. So I only looked at it kind of very simplistically as, this is a person who's clearly an agent, a foreign agent. I didn't look at it as you did. So now I'm not happy with that deal either. I didn't understand it before, but I could live with it. Now I understand it much better. So
look, there are always issues with Chinese backdoors. We're talking about Chinese technology, whether it's Huawei, whether it's ByteDance, but that's not the only issue at play here. And what I think the mistake was is not to come out more forthrightly and say, we have an issue with privacy first and foremost. There may be a Chinese government problem too that needs to be dealt with, but you got privacy issues on the one hand, and you got national security issues on the other. And let's not confuse these, because the privacy issues also apply to Facebook, maybe to Google, maybe to some of these other firms. We don't know. But there should be a standard that's applied across the board on privacy. Now, the national security stuff can be applied to China or other countries based on the threat there. There's really two separate issues. And the problem is they keep getting conflated both in the press and, unfortunately, in the policy process.
So what I'm going to ask you to do, just because you're breaking up just a tiny bit, is could you try logging off and then logging back on, and I'll see you there?
Sure. We'll try right now.
Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. And there's so many questions here that I'm so eager to have answered. And so the next one, because it's one of my favorite subjects, I'm going to wait for him to come back because he's truly an authority on this. Is Valine asks, will there be a new bipolarity based on a systemic rivalry between the USA and China? I'm very eager to get that one answered as well. And then we're also going to, and thank you so much for being here. Oh, Leland is back. Hey, Leland, I think we're better now.
Right,
I think we're better now.
Right.
So thank you very much.
Yeah.
And we're going to go backwards a little bit. So actually, we're going to go back to Valina. And Valina asked, will there be a new bipolarity based on a systemic rivalry between the USA and China?
Yes, I mean, and I think that in some ways that's bipolarity is called decoupling. Although decoupling is a much larger term. If you look at what's happening with the internet, you had the first decoupling, the first bifurcation of the world based on the fact that the Chinese took their internet, put a firewall around it, and said, here's the Chinese internet, and then here's the internet for the rest of the world. So you had that start a bunch of years ago, but nobody really saw that at the beginning of the trend. That was a censorship thing. That was very specific to the time. But what I think you're seeing right now is a total just a recognition by both the U.S. and China and just about everybody else around the world slowly that you're going to have to pick between the U.S. and China on the technological side, because if Huawei is in your system and the U.S. won't recognize or sees the national security problem with that, then you're not going to be. You can't stay in Five Eyes if the U.S. is going to kick you out of Five Eyes if you're not using the U.S. system, a system that the telecommunications system that the United States trusts. On the China side, they're going to want to decouple on the technological side too, because what they're seeing is a stranglehold by the United States over their technology companies. They can't get the they can't get the chips they need. They can't get the inputs they need in their systems. So what they need to do, and what they're intent on doing, is building up a more robust domestic base for their own technology companies, so they don't rely on the United States Department of Commerce won't have a stranglehold over their national champions. So I think both on the U.S. side and the Chinese side, for very different reasons, you're seeing this technological decoupling. A long time ago, you saw an internet decoupling. And so the question is, what other elements of decoupling you're going to see? The idea that we're going to scissor the world in half and have true, monolithic decoupling, that'll never happen. That'll never happen. But what you could see is that certain supply chains are being ripped out of China because of worries that there could be a stranglehold there. Vice versa. I think there's going to be much more concerted effort to bring supply chains closer to home and within allies and trusted countries, rather than having the U.S. and China trust each other. And so I think you're seeing elements of this decoupling, this bipolarity going forward. The mistake people make is thinking it can be absolute. It can't be absolute. No matter how much you deglobalize, you're not going to get to a point where the world's cut in half. But this is the political discussion of our age. If we want to bring more high-paid manufacturing jobs home, which may or may not be possible, but if that's what a President Trump or a President Biden thinks is going to happen, you have no choice but to globalize. You have to do that. So this is a political question now.
So will companies, American companies, cooperate in our own best interest? Because already we've seen them have what appears to perhaps be conflicts in their own shareholder return and and what might be best for America's national interest. Sometimes unfortunately, they're not harmonious. And will American companies cooperate in their participation of being an ally on our side of it and not trying to kind of play both sides against the other? I mean, already we've seen Disney, right? We've seen Disney have some real conflicts.
So some will, some won't. And we get to see this from the inside because we work with a lot of these companies who are trying to figure out these supply chain issues. But it's very important to understand that pulling supply chains out of China is very different from companies leaving China. So I think what you're going to see more and more is that a lot of companies are going into China, staying in China, doubling down in China, but they're doubling down for the Chinese market. They're not trying to produce in China for the U.S. market, for other markets. So I think that there's a difference between pulling supply chains out and leaving the Chinese market, and that's very different from reshoring, which means bringing everything back home to America, which is not going to happen. So some companies will, some won't. And I think the way this breaks down is, supply chains are often seen as this monolithic wave where you're either going to pull supply chains out, or you're going to not pull supply chains out. Well, supply chains for different industries have different vulnerabilities. Apple is not able to just pick up and leave China. This will decimate their entire economic model. But you're seeing other companies that are being forced to. And a few years ago, I agree that there was, the bottom line was more important. You had to get earnings per share up, and the numbers were counted. But I think after COVID, after a trade war, after years of what's clearly building geopolitical friction, that corporates now have a different priority here. Yes, they want to maximize shareholder value, but that may be done not just by going to the cheapest producer, but actually having a plan B and a plan C contingency plan for when you can't deal with China or you can't deal with other countries for various reasons. They are having to create contingency plans for the supply chain. So some industries are in China and resisting any pull to leave because they don't have that many options. Some are actively building up supply chains and elsewhere, and they've started the process right now to leave China. And there's a handful of industries, and pharma might be that, PPE might be that, in which the U.S. Congress and President are going to get involved, and they're going to say, this is a national security issue, this is not an economic issue, and we are going to pull those supply chains out by fiat, or by legislation. So supply chains are leaving, but it's not monolithic. You've got some that are doing one thing and some are in the other direction, and it's just different by industry.
Okay, and then we have two questions that are related to it. So I'm going to go with Jen's first. And Jen asks, have the U.S. actually been able to pressure the Chinese Communist Party into any structural changes?
No. And look, so phase one is talked about, and I don't want to get too bogged down in phase one. Phase one is seen as two things. It's talked about as a bunch of purchases, some huge numbers of purchases, and it's talked about structural changes to the Chinese economy. The problem is that structurally changing the Chinese economy, to do that, you need to do real structural adjustments, like identifying and providing transparency around local government subsidies. You have to have SOE reform. You have to have all types of things that are really structural, be really painful for China, and Beijing does not want to do them. So what you got instead, being called structural reforms, are an IP law, a market access opening. These things, look, they're not nothing, but an IP law doesn't matter if the party changes its mind on what they're going to allow it to go to the court system or how the courts are going to adjudicate. So this entire building around an intellectual protection regime in China only makes sense if the party's behind it. It doesn't matter where there's a law passed on that. And so what I would say is there has not been structural adjustment. This should have been expected from the start, because from the very beginning, American negotiators carved out Made in China 2025 and other things that could have even started delving into that. But that should have been expected, because these are very painful for the Chinese, and they don't want to do them. And they will take more pain in order to get through. And it's unlikely that the U.S. side is willing to take the type of pain in order to get China to the other side. But certainly we have not provided that pain or taken that pain in sufficient doses thus far to move the needle.
Interesting. And then, so thank you for being here, ABN Heel. And they asked, my biggest concern remains China's control of our farmer supplies and compounds.
So I share your concern. it's very hazy what is actually ring fenced within China, or where is the cutoff that China could do? That China produces a lot of chemicals that go into the pharmaceuticals. They don't usually produce most of the pharmaceuticals. So there's a lot of an argument right now about how much of a stranglehold China actually has on the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, usually you say India's got a big chunk and China's got a big chunk. The numbers are very hazy. Even people that I speak to inside the government are all over the place on this. That said, if the figures dictate that China could potentially have a stranglehold over U.S. pharmaceuticals, over U.S. medicines, over other particular things, I think this falls in the national security category, and Congress should legislate a solution to that and bring those supply chains home. That's if the figures say what I think they say, and that goes for everything. If you have a national security reason why China could have a stranglehold over supplies, critical supplies to Americans, you got to do something about it legislatively. So waiting for Congress to be involved in that, it's been on their plate. They've been talking about it. Republicans and Democrats have been going back and forth on this all year long. They started in 2019. You can't come to a solution. So I'm waiting for Congress to do something here.
Yeah, and then Luke asked, it's kind of a three-part question, and there's just not enough space. I'm going to have to go from one to the other. So he says, do you see the Belt and Road as China deploying U.S. dollars into loans for infrastructure effectively collateralized by commodities? And then he's saying, so let me click on his next one. So instead of China buying U.S. treasuries, they're lending U.S. dollars at a spread against commodities.
Sure. I mean, look, some of that makes sense. Belt and Road to me is, I think, a beast that they've lost control of. So I don't doubt that they're able that they want to do that, do some of that. If it makes sense, they're going to do it. But I think the Belt and Road became something, and then the Chinese circumstances changed, and they're trying to make the best of a bad situation. So I think that they're able to use, they will use financial architecture to try to make this work for China. But I don't think there's a grand scheme around this. The reality is that China's buying less U.S. treasuries regardless over time because there's less need to. So I don't think they have a grand scheme on how to avoid buying U.S. treasuries. I think the macroeconomic flows right now dictate the fact that China's going to buy less treasuries going forward no matter what. So I don't think Belt and Road is about disguising dollar assets. But look, there may be some of that, sure.
Okay, so now we're going to continue. And so Alan is here, and Alan and I spoke on Periscope, I guess about 2 weeks ago, because he has a new book, which I absolutely just love, called Deleted the Book. And a lot of it is about social media and how social media can kind of coerce a lot of actions, and the behavioral actions, that is. And so he, it's a question that you already addressed, but because of my so much respect for his book, if this would be an opportunity to just kind of put it into like a little meme, but we don't have the picture, so just a couple of words. So he has thoughts on the now blocked TikTok ban and the proposed Oracle TikTok deal. Could you just reiterate that just a bit?
Yeah, so I went on a pretty long rant about that a few minutes ago. But I think that the way to sort of boil this down into a handful of points to say that when the White House got into it, it was a major priority by some of the hawks in the White House to put more pressure on Chinese tech companies. And I think they thought this was going to be a much easier push than it was. And now, in addition to the fact that you have a faulty deal, a deal that doesn't deal doesn't deal with the problems at hand, whether they're privacy or national security. You have a problem with Oracle's placement in this, like we talked about, as both an equity stakeholder in TikTok, but also its regulator of content and with the ability to crack down on it in the company. There's all kinds of bad optical and financial incentive problems with the deal. But I think that the major problem is that there has not been enough thinking going into this, because this will be a precedent. And even if the next administration decides to say it's not a precedent, the Chinese government is going to hold out this resolution as a precedent if they like it. So very important that the right thinking goes into it, that the right solution is there, and it doesn't dull U.S. company interests for no reason around the world. And there's not enough thought going into it. At least there wasn't until about a week ago. And the precedent as we see it right now, if you see some of the deal as it was crafted out a couple of weeks ago, this would be a disastrous precedent. So bad across the board on this.
Gotcha. So now we're going to have, oh, I'm sorry, because you're breaking up a little bit. I missed what you said, so I interrupted. So I apologize for that. And we've got to go into like a little bit of a speed round because we've been 50 minutes now and there's a lot of questions here. So you're breaking up just a tiny bit, and I just want you to be aware of that. If there's something on your side that you can like plug in.
I've got nothing. I've got nothing attached here in 5 bars, so I'm not sure what's happening.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna just go through a lot of the questions really quick. So it's like a speed round, like one of those type of Family Feud type of things. Except you're playing by yourself. It's Family Feud, but you're playing by yourself. So somebody says, "Thank you for doing this, and thank you for joining us." What's happening in Hong Kong at this point? Any thoughts on the peg?
Yeah, look, the peg is safe. I don't think anybody involved wants to mess with the peg. I know the policymakers who are doing the Hong Kong issues right now, they have no interest in decimating the peg. People in Hong Kong don't want the peg decimated, and people in Beijing don't want the peg taken away. So I think the peg is safe. What's happening in Hong Kong is very interesting. A few months ago, you had the administration say that we were revoking Hong Kong special status, and we're done with it. And then very slow implementation of what that would actually mean. And what was being communicated back channel was, we're going to watch, Beijing, how you implement this new national security law, which looks pretty draconian from this side of the ocean. And if you start disappearing dissidents and you start cracking down on Americans or other foreigners or businesses in ways we don't like it, if you see the Chinese hand from Beijing come over and strangle Hong Kong, then we're going to get tougher and tougher and tougher. So I think in some ways Hong Kong is TBD, where everyone is watching to see how the Chinese implement the national security law, whether it's egregious. And then I think if it's considered draconian, then I think not just the administration, but I think Congress will get itself involved in this in the next year or so.
Gotcha. And I'm going to continue on to the next question. And Hong Kong is such an unknown, because the last we saw, there was just ultra violence with the triads infused with the People's Armed Police. So, there's not enough cameras over there, so we don't really know what's happening, which is also the uncertainty of it. So interesting question, because it goes into the municipal financing of the cities. And their preference to move away from real estate, which is something they've been doing over the last 2 years, is encouraging banks not to invest so heavily into real estate there, and instead to support. They're really encouraging the creditors to continue lending to their debtors that are already years in default. So, how does one best assess the Chinese real estate market, and what is your view on Evergrande?
The best way to assess the Chinese real estate market is to use China Beige book data. The way we look into this is, so we don't. That's
why I said it, by the way. That's why I said it, because I know it. Yeah,
I appreciate that. Yeah. Look, so I think the mistake made in evaluating big picture, mistake made in evaluating the Chinese property sector is they think that there's a number that represents Chinese property. For a lot of people, there's an index in which if home prices go up in X number of cities, then that's considered good. And if they go, 55, 77 cities, they go up to 60, then China's property market's doing great. We realized a long time ago that there's no one metric that captures the real estate market, because you've got very different markets on the coast and in the core and in the periphery. And so we track residential and commercial realty. We track commercial realty, commercial construction, transportation construction, all as different sectors. We break it down in every region, and we track it every different way. And so I think you have to see what the way that flows are purchases, and particularly in the residential market, are occurring. A lot of the time we see tier one fall apart. And then, of course, the national numbers on this are Chinese property sector in big trouble. But we see all those flows go into tier 4 and tier 5. And so what basically is happening is, as you see more crackdowns in a sizzling hot tier 1 or tier 2 property market, Chinese capital is driven to the other side, to tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 cities, and then they rally. Then all of a sudden, that gets good enough for tier 1, tier 2 cities, to calm down a bit, and the capital swishes back to the other side. So I think you have to have a holistic look at the sector. You have to treat realty as different than construction. So it's hard to look at it. But if we're talking about Evergrande in particular, there's a handful of very big, bad not bad, that's qualitative, big, giant Chinese property companies who have just done all kinds of crazy things with their balance sheet and invested in things and are over leveraged out the wazoo. And in a normal market economy and under a normal financial system, they would be in big, deep trouble. So the question for Evergrande is the big question for all major companies. How much support will these companies get from the state, central government, local government, other entities, in order to prop them up? Evergrande should collapse under its own weight, but whether it does is going to be based on policy coming out of Beijing, not some sort of balance sheet issue.
Okay, so we're on now. I didn't hear the last part of what you said, but it's okay because the bell rang anyway. That was on the next one. So David, thank you so much for being here. David said, does the U.S. have a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative? And how serious do we take the, and I'm just actually going to leave it there, but how seriously do we take other DevFi institutions?
One of the issues that the Trump administration is most proud of is having created what they see as a counter to Belt and Road. International lending that will go out to various countries around the globe and challenge the Chinese presence there. My own personal issue is that in most cases that's not needed. The reason, there's a reason we're not in the private firms aren't in private lending isn't in Venezuela or Central Asia or parts of Africa. It's because it's not a good investment environment. So, if there are soft power reasons to compete with China on the world stage, but the idea that we need to go tit for tat with them on lending into all developing countries, I think is a journey down the rabbit hole.
But so didn't we see, and then we're going to go to the next session, but didn't we see basically Abenomics? Right? Didn't we see kind of them building their own syndicate alternative to the Belt and Road?
Yeah, and look, there are political reasons why that's very popular. Like, we are competing with China. We are showing the Chinese that we can do the lending and we can do it better, and we can ensconce Japanese or American or whatever it might be, values abroad instead of letting the Chinese penetrate these countries. But does it work from an economic standpoint? Is it worth doing it? Maybe some places, but it would take a lot of convincing to get me to the point where.
Gotcha.
It's broader.
Gotcha. So we're going to rip through, and there's a whole bunch. So now we're at the.
I can hear a bell, by the way. Is there supposed to be a bell that I'm hearing, or is that just your?
No, it's just a bell in my head. I'm hoping you can hear the bell in my head also. But it's now like that. It's like that last part of Family Feud, right? This is like the last part of Family Feud now, where everything is really fast, right? And then like the tiles turn behind us. So so we're just going to rip through this because there's a lot and there's some really good ones. How to manage Chinese, and Jinan, thank you so much for being here. How to manage China's abuse of intellectual property.
Well, the solution so far has been to go and create a law, force the Chinese to create a law around, safeguarding intellectual property rights. That's not going to work. You got to punish violators. You target companies and then you follow through. And I think when ZTE was punished and then let go and then let go again, we have never consistently punished intellectual property violators. They should be sanctioned severely, and if they violate those sanctions, then they should be put out of business.
And I'm going to just answer that a little bit too. That I agree that the Trump rhetoric when he came in was enforcement, which is something that happens sometimes, but you don't hear when enforcement is not happening and the failures of enforcement. We don't hear those things. But it's also very difficult when we can't get, because the IP is scattered all over the world, that it's very difficult to get enforcement, because it's not like you can just arrest a bank robber. There's a lot of complexity to it, particularly when our own allies, Canada, for example, with Grace Meng over there, really is not cooperating. So there's some real difficulties to it, because again, it's not like you can just go to that, if your TV got stolen, you can just, arrest the robber and hopefully retrieve the TV set. There is a lot of complexity to that. So Maggie, thank you so much for being here. Says China wishes Belt and Road to be as a prelude to a Bretton Woods Agreement 2.0, but on its own terms.
So what are those terms? They don't want the yuan to be the global reserve currency because it can't be. So what Bretton Woods do they want? I mean, if you look at what some sort of alternative arrangement, global arrangement focused around the yuan would be, I sort of come up blank, because in order for a currency be the global reserve currency. The yuan would have to you have to take down the, they allow for capital outflows. Capital is going in and out of the country, so you got to take down the closed capital account. You have to have a deep and liquid bond market revolving around the rule of law. None of this stuff is in place right now. So, if Belt and Road is get the Chinese to adjust the international monetary system, I don't know yet what that replacement would look like, even if Beijing was given a free hand.
And we're going to continue. Luke has a question. The recent, and thank you again, Luke. And I was just listening to his Periscope, so it's pretty fun. Recently, Russia noted that 45% of trade between China and Russia was done in the U.S. dollars, and that's down from 85% in 2015.
Yeah, so this is a good example of the type of yuan internationalization that's real. So when we talk about global reserve currency, the yuan is not going to be a global reserve currency anytime soon, decades, probably never. But yuan internationalization is real in that if the Chinese can have more direct trade relationships that utilize the yuan, then that's good for them. It may send a political signal to the U.S. So yeah, I think you're going to see more of that. I think that's the trend that'll pick up.
And then he continues with that. And then we've got a lot of questions here. So where is China getting the euros to buy commodities from Russia?
Beats me.
Yeah, he's going to say that's
me. I mean, don't know.
That's a good one. Yeah. And I think a lot of that's underneath some elite mattresses as well. So it's always a very interesting story.
Possible, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer part of this. Okay. And this is again from Jen, and I'm going to make sure you guys are introed offline because I'm a big fan of Jen, and I just saw his father-in-law's movie, by the way, which was excellent. And Jen says the idea that the One Belt One Road is a relative failure is interesting. I'll go down to a little bit because a lot of people know I have a family office, and part of that is doing forensics on a lot of the EXIM, a lot of the Chinese EXIM Bank, and a lot of the AIIB, and doing forensics on the trying to figure out because those loans are so opaque that they have with their client countries, and trying to do forensics and figure out what the terms of them are. And it's an interesting thing. And then, so I would say that it's a relative failure is interesting. It is definitely a failure. There's just, and from my view, which is that part of the One Belt, One Road, and I know, Leland, you're going to contribute to that, but part of it from what I saw was also the elites trying to get their money out. It was also them trying to bolster the employment. And it was also them trying to bolster the employment within mainland, right? And as they're manufacturing, they needed to start improving their own economic situation within their own manufacturing by making higher end products and selling higher end products and more into the exporting of big equipment and semiconductor machines, everything else, telecommunications machines. Part of the One Belt, One Road was designed to downstream some of their own manufacturing to where it could be done cheaper. And then they would make agreements with Nigeria, with, I could just go down the list, Zimbabwe. And they would issue those countries very big loans. And those countries would become their leading trading partners. They would squeeze all the local indigenous competition out. These were single source contracts. And they would also China would also supply their own labor. So they would take labor from their country and fly it over to the host country. And one of the conditions that I learned from Valina, in some situations they would actually demand that that labor become patriated, which is something I hadn't realized. And that puts an enormous hurdle and burden on a country's economic growth as well. And it's a very extractive economy. So I was just in Bolivia seeing how this works in the real world. And it's just a horrendous thing. So I would say, yeah, the other part of it, and I'm taking so much time with this, is that every other country is watching this. So no country wants to be the next Sri Lanka giving up its port. And I can give you one very quick example of what's happening where you can just see evidence of it. Sri Lanka port, all the uncertainty that's happening in Nigeria right now, where they don't know, Buhari's in there and he won, and now nobody knows if they're still going to have the ports next year, and they're losing all their lumber. And the best example is looking at how the relationship between China and Pakistan has just collapsed. And that was a very crucial country for them. They need the Gwadar port, and it's just collapsing. And I could go into it in detail because I love this stuff, but I'm not going to. I'm going to give it to you, Leland.
I don't think I have much to add. I mean, I think you nailed it right at the beginning. So what you said.
I'll give you one more part of that, which is, and I'm very sympathetic to Pakistan, so I don't want there to be any confusion. These are very complex, very intricate issues that America thankfully doesn't have to experience these things. But Pakistan is still on the gray list, on the terrorist gray list. They're still having enormous problems with it. And China and Pakistan have gone some real distance between them now. And I think it's just more evidence that both that the world's kind of being bifurcated and they're really looking at different allies. And America is looking at Pakistan eagerly and seeing what's going to happen in the next turnover. So I think it's very interesting. So I haven't seen this. So Maggie says, why Blackstone, BlackRock, America Express are doubling down on their onshore renminbi business, which I want to know also.
I mean, I don't know why they make particular decisions. So I don't know what's inside their head. I know that for all the criticism that I'm layering on for what's happening in the Chinese economy or just political decisions made, China is still a very attractive place for companies to go. There's huge markets there. If you're a financial firm, there's huge opportunities to do things, maybe not in the long established banking business type sectors, but there's huge opportunities to do things in the securities world, in the bond world, in the asset management world, in the private wealth world. And so there's great opportunity there. And the fact that all these companies are doubling down is not surprising at all. Where I usually jump in the conversation to say, look, it's understandable these countries want to get in and they want to make China happy and they want to make a lot of money in China. Good for them. But they don't believe the nonsense they tell you in their own data and their own sell side reports they send out to investors. They have to say these things to keep on Beijing's not naughty list. So invest in China. But
I'm gonna ask one more question, part of that, and then we're gonna really rip through the questions, which is, what we're seeing with Disney, what we're seeing with the NBA is really, in diplomacy, what's referred to as discourse power, right? As China exercising its discourse power, which is a very precise term. So I'm not just throwing something out there kind of rhetorically, but so how can Americans kind of manage the discourse power, and we don't even know the influences and the coercion that China is putting upon those businesses?
Well, I mean, we need to be talking about it. So, I mean, one of the things I try to bring up all the time is saying, look, you don't have to critique China all the time. You don't have to critique businesses that want to make money in China, but know what you're getting. Anyone who operates in the financial world in particular should understand the concept of talking your book. Companies that are spending a lot of time in China are talking their book, either because of their investment or because they have to make Beijing happy. So if you are out there reading something that they're putting out, saying how great this recovery is, or how great that rally is, or how political troubles don't exist, then you have to wonder, what are the motivations? What are the incentives for these firms to be able to tell you the truth? And the problem is, anyone with a stake in the big China money pie is not going to give you the unfiltered truth. And that's why we operate differently. We operate with no stake in this other than to get the truth. But that's very unusual in this world.
Yeah, you guys truly are an awesome shop. And again, I think of you guys as an intel shop. I think of it as just like a lot of little James Bonds out there. So Fluid Fluxation, thank you so much for being here. Says, I guess I'll address a part of that. And then I'm going to have Leland. What other contradictions are important to distinguish between Chinese rhetoric and reality? And it's something we were just discussing yesterday. So if you could just briefly go over kind of the shadow banking system and the vulnerabilities of their own kind of the durability of their own kind of economic banking systems that are out there.
Okay, so the shadow banking may take us off in a little bit of a tangent, but do you want to address what we're seeing in terms of the shadow banking falling and right now and the shadow banking market looking different in the future, or should I talk about some other aspect of this?
Can you just give it the quick explainer of why there is a shadow banking system that's so large in China, and we'll just go on to the next question?
Yeah, sure. So there's a shadow banking system in China. The same reason there's a shadow banking system in other places, even if it looks a little bit different, is the banking system wants to maintain certain types of relationships. In China, there's heavy regulation on what what banks can loan out at what rate, and of course they want the best. They want to get the best, most reliable counterparties, and so the banking system hoovers up relationships with the biggest, the firms, the state firms, the other firms that have great political relationships and have great revenue streams. But you have an entire economy of small, medium-sized enterprises and other types of firms that maybe are more entrepreneurial, but they have dicier prospects, and the banking system with capped interest rates historically has not wanted to deal with those type of firms, because why give money to a small firm that may go bankrupt in a year when you could give money to one of these Chinese tech giants or Chinese state-owned giants where you know that their money's good from the government. So shadow banking was created around that, funneling capital that's needed around the country at higher rates to firms that aren't getting it through the formal banking system. And since that was created, now you've got the Wild West and you've got Ponzi schemes. You've got a very negative side of shadow banking out there, but you also have a very positive side of shadow banking, which is simply giving capital to firms that would not exist if they don't get that capital. So it's both good and bad.
Yeah, and I've read all the stability reports and board reports and everything that's out there that's released from China and that has to be given to stability boards. And there is a problem with it, though, in that China, and I'll go on to the next question, but China only, I think, says that there's maybe a 1% default rate on all the mortgages, and all the mortgages for the most part occur through the shadow banking system. So now we're going to really rip through just at warp speed, which is, Tim, thank you so much for being here, says, from cyber perspective, what new areas are the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and Chinese Communist Party exploiting for commerce military?
Well, I mean, I think, look, if you want a laundry list, just Google Made in China 2025, and you're going to see all the advanced manufacturing areas that China is extremely focused on building up domestically over the course of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And on most of those have very significant military applications. I won't go into quantum computing too much right now, but of course, if you want to have unbreakable cryptological communications or break everybody else, to use quantum computing. That's extremely important right now. I think what receives the most attention is probably artificial intelligence. So the question right now in China, in America, anywhere who has a large military, is how much are we going to start integrating these AI systems into our frontline military? And so these are big questions that China's dealing with along with everybody else. But I think the name of the game, there's some really good books out there that talk about AI and their military applications. I would say that's the place to start.
Okay, and I'm going to respond to this one really quick because it's an easy one. First Citizen Sam says, corruption is a non-issue as it's rampant in every system. We can't pretend the USA isn't corrupted. You've never been to China then. I can tell you right now, there's in China, and I've been there, more than once, I'll tell you that. And I think we're going on maybe 15. I'd have to count it up one day. But in China, their form of capitalism is stealing from the Chinese Communist Party. So they've created a very old, just this very durable kind of structural system of creating state-owned enterprises that then steal from the Chinese Communist Party. And it's not like corruption we have here. There you have collapsing schools, you have poisonous foods being fed to the kids in the schools, you have high-speed rails that just fall apart. I mean, there are real problems. And one of the problems that she's had to deal with when he first came into office, and he still is that they're also exporting that corruption, because then these companies are going in to fulfill overseas contracts. And as we saw with the Ecuador Dam, and we saw with the ridiculous bridge work that the Chinese were permitted to do in the United States in San Francisco, it collapsed. So there's no comparison. There's just not a comparison, and there's no enforcement capability in China against the state-owned enterprises because it's all Chinese Communist Party. So the courts are all owned by the Chinese Communist Party. So, I mean, it's just ridiculous. Okay, good question. And we'll probably try and end it a little bit right here. But if Biden becomes president, what advantages will China gain with One Belt, One Road, tech and geopolitics? And let's leave it on a conceptual framework. So not necessarily if Biden, but let's just substitute any different administrative changes.
Look, so very big picture. I don't think we know exactly how this is going to play out, but I think there's some things that we do know conceptually, and that is that going forward, the U.S. president and the U.S. political system is going to be much, much tougher on China, no matter who's president. So you're not going to see a next president or the president after that suddenly become China's friend and have this rosy relationship. This is going to go on for decades. This is the new norm. What I will caution people about is that every administration is going to have their own vulnerabilities in terms of what the Chinese are going to target to get to them. For President Trump, we talked about trade. The more you start talking about big agricultural purchases, the more you could get President Trump to tamp down the rhetoric and tamp down the policy. For President Biden, it may be climate change. He promised a bunch of climate change goodies, and you get him to tamp it down. All these administrations will have political bases that want something from China, and they're going to have to cater to those in some way while also be tougher on them in the long run. So this is going to look similar, but the various issues are going to be different depending on who the individual and what the administration around them is going to look like.
Okay, and we're going to close it with just the last few questions. So this is the fastest thing you've ever seen, right? How do you see a big, and Dan Harris, thank you so much for being here. How do you see a big uptick in manufacturing moving from China once COVID is nearly gone?
Yeah, I did. So I think that to the extent that companies and industries can move out of China to create these contingency plans, I think they'll do it. I think that some have already moved out, some are in the process of moving out, and I think some are in deep trouble. I mean, we talk about Apple and other companies that are in the telecom universe. They're going to have a very difficult time transferring their manufacturing out of country at any large scale, because these smaller Southeast Asian countries or Mexico, whoever you think you could just dump a manufacturing plant into, they don't have yet the infrastructure, the transportation networks, the skilled labor force in order to inherit this. So yes, you will see some of it. No, I don't think everyone's just going to run skedaddle out of China. And of course, remember too that there will still be a lot of manufacturing built up by these companies that will stay for providing goods to the Chinese market, independent of supply chain sending them abroad. So I think it's going to be very much a mixed bag.
And then Party Through It USA, I suppose in response to that, says drop shippers are praying for it. I don't know. I guess you know that, and I don't know how that stuff works. So I'm going to go to Lisa Lee, GTA, and we're so quick now. But biggest problem is Wall Street and approximately 700 Chinese companies listed in the U.S. Stock market.
So my take on that is that's not the problem. The problem is that the Chinese companies on U.S. stock markets don't adhere to the rules that everybody else on the exchange adheres to. So there's a big issue around delisting Chinese companies. The first thing here is there's no proposal to just kick them off. There's always these long 2 or 3 year compliance reviews in which they have to fail and fail again, and then they're kicked off. That's what we're currently talking about. But I think that this is so much more fundamental than the way it's being made out in most mainstream press. If you are on a U.S. exchange, you have to follow the rules, or you should be made to follow the rules. And that includes being made to be open to peekaboo audits, due diligence, so that the exchanges are giving the companies credibility by saying, we have looked at what these companies provide, and we can in some ways vouch for them. If you don't adhere to the exchange standards, then you're not part of that, and the exchange should not be putting you up there. So this isn't an issue about Chinese companies. They just happen to be the one, almost the only companies in the world that have squirreled out of this. This is with U.S. companies. Chinese companies should be adhering to the exact same regulations that U.S. companies on U.S. exchanges adhere to, and if they don't, then they should be thrown off. I think it's very cut and dry on that.
And the theory behind that is that perhaps they're using those companies as a nuclear bombs planted in mutual funds and planted in pension funds within America. So that's a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
So
I don't think.
I think we're now going to get to the last. So I think I'm going to have to close up on this from the emissary. They say, any thoughts on the tussle for rare earth materials? China has a large share of them.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's always a worry when China has a stranglehold over anything, whether it's materials or supply chains. But when they have flexed this muscle in the past, it came back to bite them. There was a lot of pushback from Japan and from the United States when what was it, back in 2015 when you had the issues with Malivos and the China threatening to cut off the U.S. You got to be very careful with these threats, because that is economic warfare. So what you're seeing right now is you're seeing some government involvement in the rare earth sector. But look, America doesn't want these companies here for the most part, because they're very, very dirty companies. are very dirty industries. So there's a trade-off here. We're not going to be able to bring that stuff back home. You can't reshore rare earths. It's over in China, but China has to be very careful about threatening to do something about that, because that's economic warfare, and that can get them into a much bigger brouhaha.
Okay, so now I'm just going to continue with what Dropship said, and now I'm going to find the last question. So they were discussing dropshipping partly through a USA, and they said GoDaddy created an entirely separate company to get sales in China while adhering to their rules. And Data Trade, who's a friend of mine, Kumar, and Kumar, I hope all is well with your family, says, can you ask about SIMC Semiconductors? Leland seems so knowledgeable about China.
So SMIC is in the news right now. Probably no one ever heard of them unless you're a semiconductor guy a year ago. You're a semiconductor. You know this stuff. So Huawei, everyone knows about Huawei now, but Huawei is creating China's 5G and creates their smartphones, but more importantly, 5G. Most of their advanced chips are made by Taiwan Semiconductor. Taiwan Semiconductor, because of some Department of Commerce U.S. rules, and I don't want to get too wonky here, has cut off Taiwan Semiconductor's ability to sell these advanced chips to Huawei. Now, Huawei needs chips. They need chips in order for the business to go. So the next up in line is SMIC, which is a Chinese domestic company, which does not have the ability to create this level of advanced chips, but is the best they have. So now there's a lot of attention on SMIC. Are they going to be able to keep Huawei from a death spiral? Will they be able to, with an enormous sort of government boost, be able to provide the type of advanced chips or close to it that Taiwan Semiconductor's been doing over the last couple of years? They're way behind, and they're not able to do this now. But they're in the crosshairs, and they have the ability to help the Chinese semiconductor industry from blowing apart. And that's why they're in the political crosshairs in the U.S., why they're in the government crosshairs in China. It's a very important company, but we're going to see how they play into this going forward. They're certainly in the Department of Commerce crosshairs now, but they haven't been shut down, or they haven't been cracked down on the same way that Huawei is yet.
Okay, I think we're going to close up with this last question, just from GB Ponsa. Thank you very much. It says, what of Europe? Italy seems to lean towards China. Germany seems to have second thoughts. And I'm sure this refers also to the Huawei and to, again, that bifurcation of who you're going to do business with. And the installed base of Europe, I think, is 30%. Already the installed base is 30% Huawei.
Right. Well, yeah, it's a real problem that there isn't a U.S.-Europe united front on most of these issues. You are seeing mostly a united front on Huawei just because the dangers are becoming more obvious. Look, if the Chinese government has backdoors and they're getting your communications, then you've got a real national security threat. But I think there's been a big problem in not having the U.S. and Europe aligned on issues in terms of China. So I think that's one of the things that's becoming a big political issue here. Do we want to be nicer to our allies in Europe so that they're going to back us more on our China plays? I think we should. I think we should stop talking about things that divide us. But look, this is the political issue of the age going forward.
Yeah, and the world is just such a volatile, changing place right now. So I don't really look at it as an administration type of thing. I think a lot of it is just kind of the timing. Everything in the world is just such an, we're here, right? We're in the future. So the last question is going to be, this is a really good observation, because China does have a predatory system that appeals to corruption. It is kind of their schema, particularly of the Belt and Road, where it's kind of a map of corruption that they're preying upon, particularly in these very weak economies that they're going into for their clients, and particularly also because their elites are using the Belt and Road in much the same way as the KGB was getting their money out of the USSR in the 80s. So Lisa Lee, GTA, says, one thing is to penetrate corrupt other countries' political system. The other is money laundering. They are doing both. They are definitely penetrating corrupt political systems over there. And they're also using that as a mechanism for money laundering. So what do you think, Leland? I could be wrong.
No, look, they're doing all these things, and it's a problem. It's something we've talked about a little bit today. The other side of this is as you have these corrupt deals made, and you have countries that can't pay off their debt, turn over their port, turn over some other piece of critical infrastructure, there's a popular reaction against that. There's a political reaction against that in that country. And there's also sort of an international reaction right now against the entire idea of Chinese debt diplomacy. So this is a problem. It's not good that it's happening, but there's also some negatives coming from it that China's having to deal with right now amongst many of their other headaches. And so It's unfortunate this is happening, but it's not all positive for China. They're having to deal with a lot of pushback on what they're doing because of the way some of these deals have blown up in the last couple of years.
Okay, so there's that. The question we had from before about Italy now is going to get continued. This is how we're going to close up. I'm very interested in it, but this is how we're going to close up. And I want to thank everybody. I know we had to aim for an hour, and sometimes he's run over, and it's been an hour and 24 and 35 seconds. So they say, Adam, we were discussing Europe, and that's why the system is attractive to the EU, to Europe, which is near China on state-citizen relationships, on the state-citizen relation.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, you obviously have if you look what's happening on privacy, the Europeans are ahead of the Americans in terms of pushing privacy from privacy matters. So they're not on the Chinese wavelength in terms of, state owns everything, privacy rights don't matter. So I think that's partly right. But I think it brings up a larger point, which is important, which is U.S. and European interests align, but they often don't align. And so you have to have a strategy for being able to lasso the other one together if you're going to go after China on big issues, even if your interests aren't always aligned on these things. And, the Europeans have a hard time with this. The Americans have an incredibly hard time with this. And I don't think that's going to change going forward.
And we're going to close up on this question because they're a friend of mine from overseas, and they've been so helpful with helping me compile this log of what I call the fastest roll of power in history. And part of that is COVID and everything else on its periphery. So I'm going to answer this a little bit in part, and then you'll answer, and I'll do it really quickly. Will China survive democracy? Zero chance. And I've written a lot about the social credit system that applies to businesses and that applies to people, and how it's kind of implemented, and it's kind of like the instrumentalization of people and what it does over there. But a lot of what the nucleus of China does not have a legal system that we have over here. And I know Jan was discussing before with human rights. They've never had a concept of human rights over there. They've also they escaped that movement that happened after World War II, even with establishing a legal system. And at the same time, where they survive democracy, a lot of what's in China right now is very resistant against the diaspora bringing the notions of democracy back. And that's a real war that the world is also now experiencing. And it's part of what United Front does, is not just to move that they don't want to recognize any sovereignty. Wherever their citizens of China are, as far as they're concerned, is really an extension of China. And China is very willing to broach that sovereignty. And they don't want that person over there bringing a lot of the notions of Western politics and Western cultural norms there. So what did I miss, Leland? It's all you, and then we're closing up.
Well, look, I mean, I may fall slightly different on the other side, but you're right that democracy can't survive without rule of law. You need rule of law first. You need a concept of rule of law. So you have to have that. You can't just throw democracy into the system and expect China to thrive. But I think the key part is, the question, will China survive democracy? It's a very different question. Would the Chinese Communist Party survive democracy? Could they thrive in that system or not? So I think maybe those two things have answers. Look, I don't think that China is in any way incompatible with democracy, but you need to have the foundational respect for rule of law in there, or democracy doesn't mean anything. So that first.
But then the question is always, and I'm going to close up with on it because I think a lot about this, is if China was a democracy or anything that even resembled something like that, they would be overrun by their neighbors, who are not democracies. So, it's complicated. That's what I think. I could be wrong, but I get to close up on it, I think. So I want to thank everybody for being here. It's been an hour and 28 minutes, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. And hopefully Leland and I were good guests on your Twitter feed this afternoon. And thank you, Leland, so much for joining this.
Yeah, it was my great pleasure. I hope people got something out of this.
Yeah, I definitely did. I mean, it's really interesting, even just going back to the very first seconds of our conversation, TikTok, and it's just been a remarkable conversation, one that I've really enjoyed. It's that overdue lunch and dinner that you and I were supposed to have again, and I'm just so appreciative that everyone had a chance to join us for that. So everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Bye. Now.